Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit. No lawyer, no one to defend you. Just you, alone, in front of a judge who already thinks you're guilty. What would you do? This is the story of Elijah Carter, a 20-year-old genius who found himself trapped in a legal nightmare. Arrested without evidence, judged before he could even speak. And yet, he did something no one expected. He stood up, fought back, and delivered a defense so brilliant that it left the entire courtroom speechless. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about courage, resilience, and the power of truth. But will it be enough to set him free? Stay with me, because this is a story you won't forget. The afternoon sun hung low over Bridgeport, casting golden light over the cracked sidewalks and red brick buildings of Willow Heights. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery, blending with the distant hum of traffic. Elijah Carter walked down Maple Street, his worn-out sneakers tapping against the pavement in a steady rhythm. He carried a heavy backpack over his shoulder, filled with books he had borrowed from the Bridgeport Public Library, his second home. At just 20 years old, Elijah was sharper than most law students, despite never having set foot in a university classroom. His dark skin glowed under the fading sunlight, and his deep brown eyes reflected a mind always working, always analyzing. That day felt like any other. He had spent hours buried in law books, absorbing every case study, every precedent, every loophole. He wasn't just learning, he was preparing for something, though he wasn't sure what yet. His mother always said he was meant for something great. You have a gift, Elijah, but a gift means nothing if you don't know how to use it. He smiled to himself, hearing her voice in his head. He adjusted his hoodie, tucking his hands into his pockets as he turned the corner toward Jasper's Market, a small convenience store he often stopped by for a cold drink before heading home. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The place smelled like stale coffee and cheap air freshener. An old radio crackled a jazz tune in the background. The store was mostly empty, just the cashier, Mr. Dawson, an older man with a thick mustache, and a woman browsing the snack aisle. Elijah grabbed a bottle of water and walked to the counter. "Evenin', Mr. Dawson," Elijah said, placing a few crumpled bills on the counter. Mr. Dawson nodded, barely looking up as he punched the keys on the register. "Evenin', kid." Then the peace shattered. A distant shout. Then sirens. Loud. Fast. Getting closer. Elijah turned toward the door just as it burst open. Two police officers stormed inside, hands already on their weapons. "Down on the ground, now!" For a second, everything slowed. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He turned his head, confused, looking for who they were yelling at. Then he realized they meant him. He barely had time to speak before one of the officers grabbed his arm and yanked him backward. His water bottle crashed to the floor, rolling away as his hands were forced behind his back. "Wait, what's going on?" Elijah's voice was steady, but inside, panic clawed at his ribs. "You know exactly what's going on," one of the officers spat. "You match the description." Description of what? His mind raced. He had done nothing. He had just walked in. "A robbery," the other officer said. "A store just 3 blocks away. Suspect is a young black male, dark hoodie." Elijah's stomach dropped. "That's it? That was all they needed to decide it was him?" Mr. Dawson finally spoke up, his voice uncertain. "I don't think this kid." "Stay out of it," the first officer snapped. Elijah's pulse hammered. "This isn't happening. This isn't happening." His eyes darted to the woman in the aisle. She was staring, not saying anything, not helping, just watching. The cold metal of the handcuffs locked around his wrists. Tight, too tight. As they shoved him toward the door, the whole world outside seemed to pause. People on the sidewalk turned to look. Some whispered. Others just kept walking. Elijah met the eyes of an old man sitting on a bench. The man shook his head slightly, then looked away. And right then, Elijah understood. It didn't matter that he was innocent. It didn't matter that he had been in the library all day, that he had witnesses, that he had never even been near the crime scene. None of that mattered. They had already made up their minds. As he was shoved into the back of the police car, sirens wailing around him, one thought burned into his mind. This is how it happens. The police car sped through the streets of Bridgeport, its sirens screaming into the night. The city lights blurred past the windows, but Elijah Carter wasn't looking outside. His wrists burned from the too tight handcuffs. His shoulders ached from being forced into an unnatural position, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm inside his mind. His breath was steady, controlled, but his pulse? It thundered in his ears. Think, Elijah. Think. The officers in the front seat weren't speaking to him. They barely even looked at him. To them, he was already guilty. Just another name on a report, another case closed. The older officer, the one in the driver's seat, tapped his fingers against the wheel. His name tag read S. McAllister. The younger officer, sitting in the passenger seat, had a buzz cut and a clenched jaw. His badge said J. Lawson. Lawson glanced back at Elijah through the metal partition. "You got a record, kid?" Elijah met his gaze, unblinking. "No." Lawson smirked like he didn't believe him. "Yeah, well, first time for everything." Elijah didn't respond. Anything he said would be twisted, thrown back at him. He wasn't stupid. He knew how this worked. The car pulled into the Bridgeport Police Department, a tall, gray building with harsh fluorescent lights spilling onto the sidewalk. The moment the doors unlocked, the officers yanked him out, their grip unforgiving. The station smelled like old coffee and sweat. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and voices blended into a low hum of bureaucracy. A few officers barely glanced at Elijah as he was led through the hallway, but others stared, some with curiosity, some with something else. They took him to booking. "Stand still," McAllister ordered, pushing Elijah toward the wall. A camera flashed. His mugshot was taken before he even had time to register it. His fingerprints were pressed onto ink pads, rolled onto paper. The entire process felt automatic, like he wasn't a person, just another piece of paperwork to be processed and discarded. Then came the holding cell. The metal bars clanked shut behind him, sealing him inside a small, grimy space with a cement bench and a flickering overhead light. The air was thick, stale. He wasn't alone. Two other men sat on the opposite side of the cell, their eyes immediately locking onto him. One was older, maybe in his 40s, with a scar running down his cheek. The other was younger, built like a linebacker, with tattoos creeping up his neck. Neither spoke. Elijah sat down on the cold bench, exhaling slowly. He had to stay calm, had to stay focused. Then a low chuckle came from the tattooed man. "You don't belong here, do you?" he mused, his voice deep, almost amused. Elijah glanced at him, but didn't answer. Scarface smirked. "That's how you know he's new. Still thinks staying quiet is going to save him." Elijah clenched his jaw. He didn't have time for this. The door at the end of the hallway buzzed open, and a guard stepped in. "Carter, you got your one phone call." Elijah stood, his stomach tightening. He had almost forgotten about that. They led him to a row of phones bolted to the wall. A thick chain kept him close, restricting his movements. He picked up the receiver, his fingers shaking slightly. He needed to call his mother. He dialed. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice. "Hello?" Relief hit him like a wave. "Mom, it's me." There was a pause. He could hear noise in the background like the TV was on. "Elijah?" Her voice was cautious, worried. "Yeah." He swallowed hard. "Mom, Then the call cut off. A dull beep rang in his ear. "No." Elijah gritted his teeth, pressing the buttons again, but the screen flashed. Call terminated. The officer watching him shrugged. "Guess you're out of luck." Elijah's fists curled at his sides. "Breathe. Stay in control." They dragged him back to the holding cell, and this time when the bars clanged shut, it felt like they had locked away more than just his body. Hours passed. Maybe minutes. Time didn't feel real in that place. At some point, McAllister returned. He leaned against the bars, arms crossed. "You're in deep, kid," he said casually, like they were talking about the weather. Elijah stared straight ahead. "I didn't do anything." McAllister sighed, shaking his head. "You really think that matters?" Elijah met his gaze then, and for the first time he saw it. Pity, but not the kind that meant someone wanted to help, the kind that came from someone who had already decided your fate. McAllister straightened. "You're going to be in front of a judge tomorrow. You got a lawyer?" "No." McAllister whistled low. "Damn, that's rough." Then, without another word, he walked away. Elijah sat there, staring at the metal bars. His mind was a battlefield of thoughts, strategies, fears. He had one night to figure out how to defend himself in a court that had already decided he was guilty. One night to prepare for a fight no one thought he could win. And failure wasn't an option. The air inside the holding cell was thick, stale, heavy. Time crawled at an agonizing pace, each second stretching into an eternity. The dim, flickering light overhead buzzed softly, the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Elijah Carter sat on the cold metal bench, his back against the cement wall, hands resting on his knees. His fingers curled and uncurled, a subconscious attempt to work through the tension coiling in his muscles. One night. That was all he had. One night to figure out how to defend himself in a court that had already labeled him guilty. Across from him, the other two inmates shifted lazily. The one with the tattooed neck leaned back, arms crossed, watching Elijah with mild amusement. The older man, Scarface, drummed his fingers against his knee. "You keep staring at that wall like it's going to give you the answers, kid." Elijah barely moved. His mind was racing. Legal defenses, courtroom procedures, jury psychology. Every bit of knowledge he had absorbed over the years, flipping through law books in the dim corners of the Bridgeport Public Library, was fighting to surface. But fear was loud. It clawed at his ribs, whispered in his ears, tried to tell him he was already defeated. Tattooed Neck chuckled. "You must have really pissed someone off to be here with no lawyer." Elijah exhaled sharply through his nose. "I didn't do anything." But saying it out loud wouldn't change anything. Scarface sat forward, rubbing his jaw. "Let me guess. Wrong place, wrong time." His voice held no sympathy, just recognition. Elijah finally looked up, his dark brown eyes locking onto the older man. "How'd you guess?" Scarface smirked, tapping his temple. "'Cause I was you once. First time in a cage, thinking if I just explain myself, everything will work out." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "It won't." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Then what should I do?" Scarface studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "Man, if you gotta ask that, you already lost." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Elijah didn't let it show. He turned his gaze back to the wall, focusing, trying to drown out the weight of doubt pressing on him. "This is just another problem to solve. Break it down, find the weakness, build your case." His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "You have a gift, Elijah." He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a second. The case against him, what did he know? The only thing linking him to the crime was a vague description. Young black male, hoodie. That was it. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no weapon found on him. If they had anything stronger, he would have already been interrogated. That meant there was a way out. He just had to be smarter than them. A loud buzz jolted him from his thoughts. Footsteps approached. A guard appeared on the other side of the bars, keys jingling in his hand. "Carter, you've got a visitor." Elijah frowned. "A visitor? Who? His mother? No, she would have called." The guard unlocked the cell and led him down the hallway, past rows of other holding cells, through a set of reinforced doors. The visiting area was small, lined with scratched-up plastic chairs and a thick glass partition. And sitting on the other side of the glass, waiting for him, was Detective Raymond Beckett. Elijah's stomach twisted. He had never seen the man before, but he recognized the type immediately, a cop who thought he already knew everything. Beckett was in his late 40s, tall, with graying hair and a permanent scowl. His navy blue suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he had been at this job long enough to stop caring about appearances. Elijah sat down slowly. Beckett leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His pale blue eyes studied Elijah like a puzzle he was about to solve. "You don't look like a criminal, kid." His voice was gravelly, tired. Elijah's jaw tensed. "I'm not." Beckett smirked like he had heard that 1,000 times before. "Funny thing about innocent people, they usually have lawyers." Elijah didn't blink. "Funny thing about detectives, they usually investigate before making arrests." Beckett chuckled, rubbing his chin. "I like you, Carter. You got a sharp mouth, but let me give you some free advice. Don't use it in court. That judge tomorrow, Remington, he's not a fan of smartasses." Elijah folded his arms. "Then he's not going to like me very much." The detective sighed, shaking his head. "Listen, I read your file. No priors. Good student. People at that library even backed up your alibi. But you're still here. You know why?" Elijah stared at him, waiting. Beckett's smirk faded, his voice lowered. "Because a witness placed you at the scene." Elijah's breath hitched. "A witness?" Beckett saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes and nodded. "Yeah, that's right. Someone swore under oath that they saw you running from the crime scene." Elijah's heart pounded. That didn't make sense. That was a lie. So here's the deal, kid. Beckett leaned closer. I don't think you did it, but that doesn't matter. The jury will see a young black kid in a hoodie and a witness saying you were there. That's all they'll need. You're looking at serious time. Elijah's skin prickled. Now I can help you. Beckett's voice turned almost kind. I can talk to the DA, get you a deal, plead guilty to a lesser charge, a couple of years, maybe probation. You take this to trial, you're rolling the dice. Elijah let the words settle, let the weight of them press against his ribs. This man was giving him an out, but it wasn't freedom. It was a trap wrapped in a favor. He met Beckett's eyes, unflinching. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. The detective studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he sighed and stood. Suit yourself, kid. He knocked on the glass twice, signaling the guard. As he turned to leave, he paused. You're smart, Carter, smarter than most, but being smart won't save you in that courtroom. Elijah didn't move as Beckett walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The guard came to take him back to the cell, but Elijah's mind was already somewhere else. There was no deal, no safety net, no one coming to help. Tomorrow, he would stand alone in front of a judge who didn't care, a prosecutor who wanted a conviction, and a courtroom that had already decided his fate. And if they expected him to crumble, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The morning air was thick, heavy, with the kind of tension that made every breath feel like a struggle. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom flickered faintly, their dull glow casting long shadows over the polished wooden benches. The room smelled of aged paper, old varnish, and something else, something unseen but unmistakable. Judgment. Elijah Carter stood just outside the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists, his mind running through every possible scenario. His suit, a cheap, ill-fitting one borrowed from a distant cousin, felt stiff against his skin. The tie was slightly too tight, the sleeves a bit too short. He had always imagined walking into a courtroom as a lawyer, not as a defendant fighting for his freedom. The murmurs inside were growing louder. The audience was filling the seats. Spectators, reporters, law students looking for an interesting case to observe. None of them were here for him. They were here for the spectacle. A young black man defending himself against a system designed to break him. He took a deep breath. Focus. Control. Own the moment. The bailiff called out, his voice booming. All rise for the Honorable Judge Arthur Remington. A hush fell over the room as Judge Remington entered. He was an older man, white hair neatly combed back, his face carved with deep lines of experience and authority. His robes flowed as he took his seat, and as he adjusted his glasses, his cold, piercing gaze fell on Elijah. There it was, the look, the one that said, I already know what you are. Elijah didn't flinch. He refused to. The court clerk began reading the charges, each word hitting like a hammer. The state of Connecticut versus Elijah Carter. The defendant is charged with robbery in the first degree. The prosecutor, Richard Holloway, stood, a tall, lean man with slicked back hair and a calculated smirk. Everything about him screamed confidence or arrogance. Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed. However, I must express my concern that the defendant has chosen to represent himself. Holloway turned toward Elijah with mock sympathy. Mr. Carter, are you certain about this? A criminal trial is no place for amateur theatrics. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. Elijah met Holloway's gaze without hesitation. With all due respect, sir, my life is at stake. I don't have the luxury of being an amateur. Holloway's smirk faltered for a split second before he turned back to the judge. Judge Remington exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. Mr. Carter, I strongly advise against this. You understand that if you proceed without legal counsel, this court will not make special accommodations for you? You will be expected to follow the rules of law, the same as any trained attorney. Elijah nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Remington studied him, his face unreadable, then waved his hand. Very well. The state may present its opening statement. Holloway adjusted his tie and walked toward the jury, his voice smooth and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case. The evidence is clear, the witness testimony is undeniable, and at the end of this trial, I have no doubt that you will see the truth, that Elijah Carter is guilty. He turned slightly, casting a glance at Elijah. This isn't about race, it isn't about injustice. It's about facts, and the facts do not lie. Elijah sat still, emotionless. Not yet. Let him dig his own hole. When Holloway finished, all eyes turned to Elijah. It was his turn. He stood, straightened his tie, and stepped forward. The room seemed to lean in, waiting for him to stumble, to crack under pressure. He placed his hands on the podium, his voice calm, clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me tell you what this case is really about." A pause. A calculated breath. "It's about assumption." Murmurs. The judge raised an eyebrow. Elijah continued. "I was arrested based on a vague description. Black male, hoodie, no fingerprints, no weapon found, no surveillance footage of me at the crime scene. Yet here I stand, charged with a crime I did not commit. Why? Because someone said they saw me." He turned, looking at each juror individually. Not because they had proof, not because they had facts, but because they assumed. A silence stretched across the courtroom, thick like fog. Elijah took a step back, nodded once, and returned to his seat. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, Judge Remington actually looked at him. Not past him, not through him, at him. "Proceed, Mr. Holloway." And just like that, the battle began. The air in the courtroom had shifted. Elijah could feel it, subtle but undeniable. His opening statement had left ripples in a space where no one expected him to make a single splash. The prosecutor, Richard Holloway, wasn't smiling anymore. The judge was watching him more closely now, as if trying to decide whether he was just another fool or something else entirely. But Elijah knew better than to think a single moment of clarity would save him. He was still an underdog. A young black man standing alone against a system that didn't just assume his guilt, it depended on it. Holloway stood from his seat, adjusting his suit jacket as he walked toward the center of the courtroom. His confidence was back, but there was something new in his posture, annoyance. Elijah had made him work harder than he expected. "Your Honor, the state calls Detective Raymond Beckett to the stand." A door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Beckett walked in. The same man who had tried to push Elijah into taking a plea deal. He moved with ease, his expression unreadable, his suit crisp. This wasn't his first time on the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and Beckett settled into the chair, adjusting the microphone. Holloway stepped forward. "Detective Beckett, please state your name and occupation for the record." "Raymond Beckett, detective with the Bridgeport Police Department." Holloway nodded as if he were speaking to an old friend. "Detective, can you tell the court what led to the arrest of the defendant, Elijah Carter?" Beckett exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if this was just another routine case. A robbery was reported at a liquor store on Fremont Avenue. The suspect was described as a young black male in a dark hoodie. Officers in the area spotted Mr. Carter a few blocks away, wearing a hoodie that matched the description. When approached, he became nervous and uncooperative. Elijah's jaw tightened. Uncooperative? He had barely been given a chance to speak before they shoved him into the police car. Holloway paced slowly. "And was there any physical evidence linking Mr. Carter to the crime?" Beckett hesitated, just for a second. "No fingerprints, no weapon recovered." Holloway barely blinked. "But there was a witness, correct? Someone who saw Mr. Carter fleeing the scene?" Beckett nodded. "Yes, a store clerk identified him as the man running from the scene." Holloway turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it for yourselves. A direct eyewitness account. That alone carries significant weight." He turned back to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Remington barely nodded before shifting his gaze toward Elijah. "Mr. Carter, your witness." A rustle moved through the courtroom. The murmurs had returned, hushed but unmistakable. They were waiting for him to stumble, to prove that he didn't belong here. Elijah rose slowly, buttoning the front of his ill-fitting jacket as he walked toward the stand. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he pushed it down. Control. Command the space. He stopped a few feet from Beckett, letting the silence stretch. Then, in a steady voice, he said, "Detective Beckett, you said the witness identified me. Can you tell the court how exactly that happened?" Beckett's expression didn't change. The witness was brought to the scene shortly after Mr. Carter was detained. He confirmed that Mr. Carter matched the description. Elijah nodded slowly. "Matched the description. A young black male in a hoodie." He turned toward the jury. "Detective, would you say that description could apply to hundreds of young men in this city?" Beckett shifted in his chair. "The description was specific enough for officers to act on it." Elijah's voice remained calm, but he took a deliberate step closer. Was it? Or was it vague enough that any young black man on the street that night could have been stopped? The murmurs grew louder. Beckett exhaled sharply through his nose. Officers had reason to believe. Had reason to assume, Elijah cut in. They assumed I was guilty based on nothing but a broad description and the color of my skin. Holloway rose from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. Overruled, Judge Remington said without looking up. His eyes were still on Elijah. Elijah turned back to Beckett. You also mentioned I was acting nervous when the officers approached me. Tell me, Detective, how should an innocent man react when he is suddenly thrown to the ground and handcuffed? Beckett's jaw tightened. Elijah took another step forward, his voice steady. You didn't find fingerprints. You didn't find stolen goods. You didn't find a weapon. But you arrested me because I was there, because I fit a description that meant nothing. For the first time, Beckett didn't have an immediate response. Elijah turned toward the jury, letting his words settle. What happened to me that night wasn't about evidence. It was about assumption. It was about deciding my guilt before even asking the right questions. The silence in the courtroom was thick now, stretching, waiting. Judge Remington exhaled through his nose. Detective Beckett, you may step down. Elijah turned and walked back to his seat, his hands steady, his heart still racing. Holloway had been right about one thing. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about survival. And Elijah wasn't here to entertain. The courtroom air felt different now. Heavy, like a storm was rolling in. The weight of Elijah Carter's cross-examination of Detective Beckett still lingered, hanging in the silence like an echo no one could ignore. The jury had leaned in. The spectators had gone quiet. Even Judge Remington had shifted in his seat, watching Elijah with something that almost resembled curiosity. But Elijah knew better than to think he had won anything yet. This was just the beginning. The prosecution had played their hand, thin evidence, a questionable witness, and a whole lot of assumption. Now it was his turn. Elijah stood, adjusting the stiff collar of his borrowed suit, and stepped toward the center of the courtroom. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. He didn't just speak, he commanded the space. Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Daniel Grayson to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel Grayson was the store clerk, the only eyewitness tying Elijah to the crime. If Elijah could dismantle his testimony, the entire case would collapse. The doors opened at the back of the courtroom, and a man in his mid-50s walked in. He was short, stocky, with thinning gray hair and a nervous energy that clung to him like static. He adjusted his cheap button-down shirt as he made his way to the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and Grayson licked his lips before nodding, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium like a lifeline. Holloway wasted no time. He rose smoothly from his seat and approached the stand, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Mr. Grayson, on the night of the robbery, did you or did you not see the defendant fleeing the scene? Grayson swallowed hard. I did. Holloway turned toward the jury, his face painted with false sympathy. And just to clarify, you're absolutely certain it was Elijah Carter you saw? Grayson nodded, but it wasn't confident. Yes, I saw him running. I remember. Elijah tilted his head slightly. There it was, the hesitation. Holloway nodded as if that was all he needed. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Remington turned to Elijah. Mr. Carter, your witness. Elijah rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the stand. His steps were measured, his breathing steady. He could feel every eye in the room on him. When he reached the stand, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied Grayson, really studied him. The nervous tapping of his fingers, the way his eyes flicked to Holloway as if looking for approval. Then, finally, Elijah spoke. Mr. Grayson, I want you to take a deep breath. Grayson blinked. What? Elijah's voice was calm, steady, a deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just humor me. Confused, Grayson did as he was told. The jury watched in silence. Elijah nodded. Good. Now tell me, where exactly were you standing when you saw me? Grayson shifted in his seat. At the register. Elijah took a step closer. And where was the suspect when you saw him? Running out the door. Elijah nodded. And how far is the front door from the register? Grayson blinked. Maybe 15 feet. Elijah turned toward the jury. 15 feet, through a glass window. At night. while the suspect was running. The room was silent. Elijah turned back to Grayson. What was the lighting like outside? Grayson hesitated. Not great, streetlights, but not much else. And yet, in that dim light, through a glass door at a moving target 15 feet away, you're absolutely certain you saw my face. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. I mean, he looked like you. Elijah's eyes sharpened. Looked like me? Grayson realized his mistake too late. His eyes darted to Holloway, who was sitting rigid in his seat. Elijah leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to draw the jury in. Mr. Grayson, did you identify me because you actually saw my face, or because when the police brought you to the scene, I was already in handcuffs? Grayson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I mean, the officer said they had the guy. A whisper moved through the courtroom. Elijah nodded slowly. So when they asked if I was the one you saw, what were you supposed to say? No. When I was already in cuffs. Grayson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Elijah turned to Judge Remington. Your Honor, I request that the witness's testimony be stricken from the record. Holloway shot up. Objection, Remington sighed. On what grounds, Mr. Holloway? Holloway hesitated. The witness has identified the defendant. Remington looked at Grayson, then back at Elijah. And yet, it seems that identification is less than reliable. Elijah met the judge's eyes, unwavering. Remington exhaled heavily. Motion granted. The jury is instructed to disregard Mr. Grayson's testimony. Elijah sat back down, his heart still racing but his face unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, but he had just taken down the only direct witness against him. And for the first time since this trial began, the jury was listening. The courtroom felt different now. The air was thick with something unspoken, an unsettling shift that no one was ready to acknowledge. For the first time since the trial had begun, Elijah Carter wasn't just defending himself. He was winning. The murmurs had quieted, replaced by something heavier. Attention. Real, undivided attention. Even the jury, who had once looked at him with distant curiosity, some with suspicion, was now seeing him differently. Judge Remington adjusted his glasses, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished wooden desk in front of him. His expression, once unreadable, now held something else. Calculation. Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain still, even though his pulse was hammering in his chest. He had just dismantled the prosecution's key witness, revealing that the store clerk's testimony was based not on certainty, but assumption. That was the cornerstone of the case against him. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Across the room, Prosecutor Richard Holloway stood, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edges of the table. His confidence, once unwavering, was cracked. For the first time, Elijah saw it in his eyes. Frustration. And that meant something important. Holloway was rattled. The prosecutor cleared his throat and turned toward the judge. Your Honor, the state requests a short recess. A desperate move. A stalling tactic. Judge Remington raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. You've just had a recess, Mr. Holloway. Are you unprepared to proceed? Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. No, Your Honor. The state is prepared. Remington sighed. Then proceed. Elijah watched as Holloway straightened his tie and turned back to the jury, his polished facade slipping slightly. But he wasn't a fool. He knew how to recover. Holloway took a slow step forward, his voice smooth again. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's not lose sight of the facts. Yes, there were weaknesses in Mr. Grayson's testimony, but let's not pretend that means the defendant is innocent. Elijah stayed silent, watching him work. Mr. Carter was found near the scene. He matched the suspect's description. And most importantly, Holloway's voice sharpened. He had no solid alibi for the time of the crime. Elijah tilted his head slightly. No alibi? Holloway smirked. Mr. Carter claims he was at the library that evening, but there are no time-stamped records proving exactly when he left. Isn't that convenient? A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elijah's fingers curled slightly. Convenient? Holloway turned to him, his smirk widening. Mr. Carter, since you've chosen to represent yourself, let's give you a chance to explain. He gestured toward the witness stand. Why don't you take the stand and testify? That is, unless you have something to hide. It was a trap, a well-placed one. Elijah knew the risks. If he took the stand, Holloway would pick him apart, twist his words, paint him as something he wasn't. But if he refused, the jury would see only one thing: fear. Elijah adjusted his jacket and stood. I have nothing to hide, Mr. Holloway. The room tensed as Elijah walked toward the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and for the first time since the trial began, he was no longer just the defendant. He was the witness. Holloway wasted no time. He paced slowly, hands behind his back. Mr. Carter, you claim you were studying at the Bridgeport Public Library on the night of the crime. Is that correct? Elijah met his gaze, steady. That's correct. And what time did you leave the library? Elijah took a breath. Around 9:30 p.m. Holloway's lips twitched. He turned to the jury. And the robbery occurred at approximately 9:40 p.m. That's only a 10-minute window, isn't it? Elijah didn't blink. It is, but there's something you're not mentioning. Holloway raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that? Elijah leaned forward slightly. The library is nearly 3 miles away from the crime scene. The words hit like a slow-building wave. The jury's heads turned slightly. A few people in the audience stirred. Judge Remington narrowed his eyes. Elijah continued. Let's do the math. I left the library at 9:30 p.m. The robbery happened at 9:40 p.m. That means, according to your version of events, I somehow covered 3 miles on foot in less than 10 minutes. A pause. A crack in the wall. Elijah tilted his head. Tell me, Mr. Holloway, have you ever run 3 miles in 10 minutes? The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even a few muffled chuckles. The jury members were suddenly fully awake, leaning forward, their expressions shifting. Holloway's face reddened, his mouth opened, then closed. He turned toward the judge. Objection. Judge Remington held up a hand. His gaze was locked on Elijah, his fingers steepled under his chin. Then slowly he exhaled. The objection is overruled. Elijah didn't move, didn't smile, but he had just done something no one had expected. He had forced them to think. The courtroom had changed. The cold indifference that once filled the space had been replaced by something else, uncertainty. Elijah Carter sat on the witness stand, his hands resting in his lap, his back straight. His heart was pounding, but he refused to let it show. The weight of the trial, of his own fate hanging in the balance, was pressing down on him, but he wouldn't break. Not now. Not when the truth was finally cutting through the thick walls of assumption and prejudice that had built this case against him. Across the room, Prosecutor Richard Holloway stood frozen. His usual confidence was flickering like a dying flame. He had walked into this trial expecting an easy win, an open and shut case against a young black man with no lawyer, no resources, no way to fight back. But now, Elijah had exposed the impossible timeline. He had torn apart the prosecution's only witness, and more importantly, he had done something no one expected. He had made them think. Holloway cleared his throat and straightened his tie, trying to recover. He turned back to Elijah, his voice controlled but sharper than before. Mr. Carter, let's not get ahead of ourselves. He walked slowly toward the jury, his tone laced with forced patience. Just because the timing is tight doesn't mean it was impossible for you to be at the crime scene. Maybe you had help. Maybe you took a shortcut. Elijah watched him carefully. He's grasping at straws. He met Holloway's gaze, unwavering. Or maybe I just wasn't there. The words hung in the air. Holloway exhaled sharply through his nose, then turned back toward the jury, trying to regain control. We're focusing too much on one detail. Let's remember what really matters here. Mr. Hope Carter was found near the scene. He fit the suspect's description. And Elijah cut in. His voice wasn't loud, but it commanded the room. What suspect's description? Holloway's jaw tensed. Excuse me? Elijah turned slightly, his eyes scanning the jury, making sure they were still with him. What description are we talking about? Black male in a hoodie? Do you know how many black men in Bridgeport wear hoodies? Do you know how many were walking home that night? How many were just minding their business? Silence. Elijah leaned forward, his voice measured, steady. Let me ask you something, Mr. Holloway. If I were white, wearing a hoodie that night, would I be sitting here right now? A heavy pause fell over the courtroom. Holloway's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He glanced at the judge, but Remington didn't stop him this time. The prosecutor exhaled, forcing a smirk. Mr. Carter, let's not turn this into something it's not. Elijah tilted his head. Oh, I think we should, because that's exactly what this case is about. He turned to the jury again, his eyes locking onto theirs, one by one. I was arrested not because I was guilty, but because I was convenient. Because I looked like the kind of person who would do something like this. That's the real reason I'm here. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some nodded. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Elijah turned back to Holloway. And you know what? You were counting on that. You were counting on me folding under pressure, on me playing the part you expected, a scared, uneducated kid with no options. But here's the thing. He leaned in slightly, voice steady, deliberate. I'm not that guy. Silence. Thick. Unshakable. Judge Remington sat back in his chair, watching Elijah with something unreadable in his expression. The jury members exchanged glances. Even the court stenographer had slowed her typing, as if caught in the weight of the moment. For the first time, Elijah saw it in their eyes. Doubt. Not about him. About the case. About everything they had assumed was true. He had done what he came to do. He had forced them to see him not as a suspect, but as a person. And now, he just had to wait for the truth to do the rest. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from a lull in conversation, but something thicker. A silence filled with weight, with realization. For the first time since this trial began, the jury wasn't just looking at Elijah Carter. They were seeing him. The prosecutor, Richard Holloway, sat stiffly in his chair, his once smooth composure fractured. His jaw was clenched, his fingers drumming against the table. He was waiting. Waiting for a lifeline. Waiting for the moment to take back control. But it was too late for that. Judge Remington cleared his throat, his sharp gaze flicking between the attorney's table and Elijah, who still sat at the witness stand. His fingers pressed together, steepled beneath his chin, as if weighing a decision he hadn't expected to struggle with. Finally, he exhaled. The jury will now deliberate. The bailiff stepped forward, guiding the jury members out of the room. The heavy wooden doors clanked shut behind them, leaving Elijah with nothing but the buzzing tension in the air. He had done everything he could. Every word, every argument, every fact. It was all out there now. And yet, sitting alone at the defense table, with no lawyer by his side, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that it still might not be enough. Because truth alone didn't always win. Perception did. He could still lose, not because he was guilty. Not because the prosecution had a strong case, but because the world worked a certain way, and it wasn't built for people like him to walk out of places like this as free men. A slow creak echoed through the chamber as Judge Remington stood. Court is in recess until the jury reaches a verdict. And just like that, it was out of his hands. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, the only sound in the otherwise empty space. Elijah sat on the hard plastic chair, his hands folded between his knees. He tried to keep his breathing steady, but his pulse had other plans. It had been 2 hours since the jury left. 2 hours of staring at the same white walls. 2 hours of trying not to think about every single way this could go wrong. The door swung open. A guard stepped inside. "They're back." Elijah nodded, stood, and followed him down the long hallway, his footsteps sounding louder than they should have. By the time he walked through the doors, the courtroom was already packed. The jury was in place. Holloway sat rigid at the prosecutor's table. The judge had returned to his seat. The tension was so thick, it threatened to choke the air out of the room. Elijah's hands were steady as he sat back down. He forced himself to breathe. One last time. Judge Remington turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in the front row, mid-40s, short-cropped hair, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, stood, the jury foreperson. She held a small piece of paper in her hands, the weight of it pressing against her fingers like lead. Elijah watched her closely. She swallowed before speaking, and for the first time a sliver of hope crept in. She looked up. "We, the jury, find the defendant." A breath, a beat, not guilty. A second passed, then two, then chaos, gasps, murmurs, voices overlapping. Somewhere in the gallery someone let out a soft, "Oh my God." Elijah blinked as if his brain had short-circuited. Not guilty. Not guilty. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls of his skull like they were unreal. Judge Remington lifted his gavel. Bang. Order in the court. The murmurs died down, but the energy had changed. Judge Remington turned his sharp gaze to Elijah. For a moment, the old man just looked at him, as if assessing something he hadn't fully understood until now. Then, finally, he spoke. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go." Elijah exhaled, a real breath for the first time in days. He stood slowly, his knees feeling almost weak. He had prepared himself for everything, except this. The weight that had been crushing him for so long, the invisible chains of assumption and doubt, had been cut loose. And yet, as he walked toward the exit, as the doors opened to the world waiting outside, he realized something. This wasn't just a victory, it was a beginning. The moment Elijah Carter stepped out of the courtroom, the sunlight hit him like a wave. For the past few days, his world had been confined to gray walls, cold floors, and voices that only saw him as a case file, a statistic, a problem to be solved. But now, as he stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the city of Bridgeport stretched out before him. The air smelled different out here, crisper, freer. He was free. The realization crashed into him, and for a second, he just stood there, gripping the metal railing as if his body hadn't caught up with his mind. The world hadn't stopped for his trial. People still bustled up and down the sidewalks. Cars honked, pigeons picked at crumbs near the steps. Life had moved on, and yet everything felt different. A cluster of reporters had gathered at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones were held high, voices overlapped in a chaotic storm of questions. Elijah, how does it feel to be a free man? What do you think of the justice system now? Will you be taking legal action? Elijah exhaled slowly. He wasn't ready for this. Not yet. He scanned the crowd, looking for the only face that mattered. Then there she was, his mother, Angela Carter, standing just beyond the reporters, her hands clutched together, her face a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something else, pride. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The cameras, the noise, the chaos, it didn't matter. She pushed through the crowd, and before Elijah could even take another breath, she pulled him into the tightest embrace of his life. He felt her tremble against him. My baby, oh Elijah. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against her shoulder. I'm okay, Mom. She pulled back just enough to cup his face in her hands, searching his eyes as if she needed to see for herself that he was really here, that this nightmare was truly over. They tried to take you from me, Elijah. Her voice wavered. They tried, but God, she inhaled sharply. God had other plans. Elijah swallowed hard. He had held everything together during the trial, had forced himself to be strong, to stay focused, to fight. But now, standing here in his mother's arms, the weight of it all finally hit him. The fear, the anger, the helplessness. His breath hitched, but he wouldn't let himself break. Not yet. She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. You were born for something greater, Elijah. Don't ever forget that. He nodded, unable to speak. The world around them was still watching. The cameras still rolled. The reporters still shouted questions, but Elijah wasn't answering them today. Instead, he turned to his mother, offering a small, tired smile. Let's go home. She nodded, looping her arm through his as they made their way down the courthouse steps, leaving the chaos behind. The ride home was quiet. The hum of the car engine, the city moving past the window, it all felt unreal. Elijah stared out at the streets he had walked 1,000 times before, seeing them differently now. The corner store where he had been arrested looked smaller somehow. The streetlights, the cracked sidewalks, the people moving through their daily routines, it was all the same, and yet he was not. When they reached their small apartment in Willow Heights, Elijah hesitated before stepping inside. Everything was exactly how he had left it. The scent of his mother's vanilla candles filled the air. The old couch still had the blanket draped over it from the last time he had been here. His books were stacked neatly on the kitchen table, just as he had left them. But he wasn't the same person who had walked out of this door days ago. His mother watched him carefully. Take your time, baby. He nodded slowly and stepped inside. The warmth of home wrapped around him, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of judgment pressing down on him. He sat at the kitchen table, running his fingers over the smooth covers of his books, the ones he had spent years reading, studying, preparing for a future he wasn't sure would ever come. And then he knew. This wasn't the end of the road. This wasn't just a fight for his own freedom. How many others had sat in a jail cell just like he had, with no one to defend them? How many had been swallowed by a system that wasn't designed to give them a chance? He couldn't be the only one, and if the world wouldn't fight for them, then he would. His mother sat across from him, watching the gears turn in his mind. She smiled knowingly. "You already know what you need to do, don't you?" Elijah looked up, exhaling slowly. Then he nodded. "I'm going to law school." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She just smiled, reaching for his hand. "Then you fight, Elijah. You fight for the ones who don't have a voice." And he would, because the world had tried to silence him, tried to break him. But Elijah Carter wasn't just going to survive. He was going to change everything. Wow, what a journey. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope Elijah's story inspired you as much as it inspired me. It's a powerful reminder that truth, courage, and perseverance can change everything. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Your support means the world and helps us bring more incredible stories to life. See you in the next one. Stay inspired, stay strong, and remember, your voice matters.